Good morning and welcome. I'm Rick Carney, coordinator for the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative. For those of you who may be new to the Landscape Conservation Cooperative, or LCC, we are a partnership among public and private groups that are working together to meet large-scale conservation challenges across the 5-state Great Basin region. Over the past 5 years, we have supported a variety of conservation projects on high-priority topics. This series highlights a few of those projects, plus more. We hope that these webinars can provide a platform for discussion about the research and its application to conservation challenges in the Great Basin. We will keep today's presentation relatively short, about 30 minutes or so, and reserve the second half hour for questions and discussions with the presenters. Since there are quite a few people on the webinar today, we are asking you to type in your questions as they arise rather than interrupting the speakers to ask them during the flow. If you do so, we will be able to read out your questions for the speakers at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on our website in just a few days. This is the fifth of our webinars this year, and all of the recordings for past webinars are on our website under greatbasinlcc.org. Now, how do you submit your questions? On your screen, you'll notice a small collapsed control panel in the upper right-hand corner. If you click on the small arrow, you can expand this control panel. And in the expanded control panel, down at the bottom, there is an area where you can type in your question. Simply type it into that chat area and press send. As I said before, this question will be sent to us to respond to at the end of the webinar. Moving along, I would like now to introduce today's speakers, Erica Fleishman and Jimi Gragg. Dr. Erica Fleishman is professor, Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology, and also the director for the Center for Environmental Management of Military Lands at Colorado State University. She's a researcher in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis as well. She has studied responses of wildlife to changes in land use, land cover, and climate in the Intermountain West and California for more than 25 years, with a non-exclusive focus on butterflies and birds. She is proud to work with a stellar transdisciplinary and fun group of management and research colleagues. Jimi Gragg is a biologist with Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, where for the past decade he has coordinated the development and implementation of the State Wildlife Action Plan. Previously, he did similar work in Florida. He began his career with a series of seasonal non-game wildlife jobs with the U.S. Forest Service across Northern California, and followed those with an interesting and rewarding period with Georgia Pacific Corporation in Mendocino County, California. He has bachelor's and master's degrees from Humboldt State and Colorado State Universities, respectively. His graduate work involved improving the control of brown tree snakes on Guam. And I'd like now to turn the microphone over to Dr. Fleishman to give us her comments. Erica?
Thanks very much, Rick. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk with all of you today. I wish we were all in person. It's a slightly awkward format for everyone, but it's still a nice way for everyone to be able to exchange information and ideas. Jimi, I hope you'll just jump in as you see fit. You should be on the phone, and I don't know if there's anything you want to say starting off.
No, I can do that. I guess I'm assuming the phone works.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We really see the Great Basin, although we're working in it, a lot of us as scientists and managers, I think all of us are also seeing it as people. And I take a lot of comfort and pride in some of the things that other people have said about a pretty phenomenal region. And this is one of the most touching to me. We're currently about halfway through a project that is supported by a couple different groups, which I'll mention in a second. And the objectives of that project relate to interactions among cheatgrass, precipitation, and fire. There's also a piece of the project during which we are trying to improve methods of modeling current and future cover of shrubs and also of herbaceous vegetation, largely forbs, but to some extent both forbs and grasses. We're also trying to understand how various types of environmental change may affect habitat quality and occupancy of breeding birds in diverse vegetation types. Part of the project, we have a focus on pinyon and juniper and also on sagebrush systems, but thanks to work we've done over the years, we're also taking a look at riparian systems. And because we are just partway through this project, toward the end of the webinar today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the inferences that are emerging from our work in riparian ecosystems over time. A ton of people have worked on this. Since Jimi is one of the presenters, I didn't list him here, and I'm sure that I'm leaving people off, but this is our current suite of co-conspirators on the project, and we're very grateful for current financial support from the Joint Fire Science Program and the Northwest and Southwest Climate Science Centers, and they're being facilitated by the Great Basin LCC. We've also, over the years, had support from a number of different federal and private programs, all of your taxpayer dollars at work. And so since some of the work I'll be presenting today draws from their sponsorship, I wanted to give credit where credit is due and to say how grateful we are for the support. The work that we've done over the years has been around the Great Basin, and as most of you are well aware, the Great Basin, although it's treated as one large biome, also has some pretty well understood biogeographic subdivisions where the vegetation and the climate are somewhat distinct among the regions. One of the long-term interests that our group has is looking at some of the similarities and differences among those regions. So for example, if a management prescription, as it were, is thought to apply to the entire region, how do some of those biogeographic differences across the Great Basin as a whole affect the effectiveness of various management actions? So we've worked in the Central Great Basin. David Dobkin, who's one of our good colleagues, has worked in that region since the mid-'80s. I've worked out there since the early '90s. We've also worked in the Western Great Basin, and that's one of the locations for this project. This is a view from Mount Grant overlooking Walker Lake. We've worked in that area since the mid-'90s. We also, through this project, have the excellent fortune to be working up in the Oahe uplands in southern Idaho and in Jimi's home country in central Utah. So it's a pretty phenomenal place to be working and to learning about these systems and to be working with our management colleagues in all of these regions. Our representation here, the dots are representing some of our study canyons in the Western and Central Great Basin, and then for now, just the dots representing the Oahe uplands in Utah. So you can get a sense of, we're trying to span as much of the region as possible in terms of that biogeographic variation, which is both rewarding and occasionally makes the logistics a little bit challenging. We've had an emphasis throughout the years, but explicitly with this project on communication among the management community and the research community. And thanks to the support of the climate science centers, we've been able to have fairly regular field trips that have brought everyone together. So we had field trips in both Idaho and Utah, both last year, 2016 and 2017, and hopefully we'll be able to continue doing that and also have some regular opportunities for interaction with the management and research communities throughout Nevada. One of the obstacles that everyone is encountering in trying to do work with cheatgrass is a lack of field data. And so there are a lot of different methods for collecting field data, but simply the fact that the field data are sparse over such a large region is somewhat of a challenge. And I'm not going to get too much into it today, but as part of our work to try to improve some of the modeling of different vegetation types, we've been experimenting with a lot of different remotely sensed methods. So in 2016, we were able to take a carbon fiber fishing pole and experiment with taking some photographs off of that. This past year, this is from our field trip in Utah, we were able to experiment with flying drones at different altitudes. That work is still very much in progress. So we're trying to use some fairly fine resolution aerial imagery to see if we can get a better handle on continuous cover of cheatgrass and also of shrubs and of herbaceous vegetation. So I'm not going to have very much to say about that today other than it's an active ongoing area of research for us. But given the information that exists now from the field, one of our colleagues on this project, Bethany Bradley, has been working for years on cheatgrass and fire. She's working pretty closely with Jennifer Balch's group at University of Colorado. Bethany's at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And she's looking at the available data on cheatgrass now, and first of all, trying to understand some of the best ways to model the cover of cheatgrass across the Great Basin as a whole. And she's looked at this in two ways, again, given the constraints on the currently available data. One is to look at cheatgrass as continuous percent cover, which I think is what we all would like to be able to do. So, 1%, 3%, 7%, 15%, 17%, just continuous from 1 to 100. And the best models that she's found, trying to look at that continuous percent cover and applying that to field data gathered by probably 15 or so different studies, either things that have been published or readily available data sets. She's been able to explain about 30% of the variation in continuous cover of cheatgrass across the Great Basin as a whole. The other thing that she's experimented with, or one of the other things that she's experimented with, is to say, okay, what if we turn it into more of a binary measure where we say low abundance versus high abundance, and abundance in this case corresponding to percent cover, and just set a threshold. And these are arbitrary but repeatable. They can be changed. When she used a criterion of 15% cover for high abundance, so saying in the data if 0 to 14% was low abundance and then 15% cover and greater was high abundance, the accuracy of the models that she and her group are working on increased dramatically. And so that's sort of where we are now, given the state of the available data, that the accuracy of the modeling methods really depends on the response variable. And there's, again, going to be a lot of thought to what can be done to improve the field data and to think about what response variables not only yield fairly accurate models, but are informative for management purposes. So now looking at that 15%, and this is all from some work that Bethany and her colleagues have, it's been submitted to a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and the work is currently in review. As you all are well aware, when you look at cover across the region, now using that 15% threshold for high abundance, cheatgrass cover is extensive across the Great Basin, and that can be looked at in a couple of different ways. AVHRR is both that and Landsat or satellite images. Landsat is somewhat finer resolution than AVHRR. And again, what we're trying to do in this project is get down to even finer resolution. So being able to say within a grazing allotment, for example, can we get a better handle on cover in that area within a sage-grouse management area, something smaller even than what these satellite images will provide us with. And so that's ongoing through this project as well. Bethany and Jennifer and their students and colleagues have done a lot of work and continuing to do a lot of work on the changes in fire dynamics that are associated with cheatgrass. And I know that this is, in a general sense, familiar ground to everyone who's participating in this webinar. So what they've found is areas with high abundance of cheatgrass, and in this case using that 15% threshold, twice as likely to burn as those with low abundance, more likely to burn multiple times. Also, fires in cover-dominated cheatgrass generally are occurring earlier than fires in other vegetation types. And one of the most intriguing things that's coming out of this work is that now if you're looking at those continuous cover measurements, they're finding that there's a pretty substantial increase in probability of fire with very little cheatgrass in the system. They're finding that the probability of fire actually levels out at what many of us would think of as fairly low cover. So if you think about something like 15 or 20% cover and then maybe going up to 50% cover, they're not finding a major difference in the probability of fire as you get to those really high levels of cover. And the other thing that we've been thinking about as a project, if we think about 1 to 5% cover, my first thinking is, well, that's really not very much. But one of the things we're finding is if most of us look at cheatgrass sort of from the side, and if you look at it from the side, if you're standing on the ground at normal person height, cheatgrass looks pretty dense, and you might say, gosh, that looks like 70% cover, something like that. If you're looking at cover from above, the way an aerial image will, you're almost never going to see cover that's more than a couple tenths of percent, even when it's a pretty thick monoculture, because the strands of cheatgrass are so narrow. So the way that that a camera from above sees the cheatgrass, it's actually pretty sparse. There's a lot of bare ground in between. And so that's probably something that we're going to be thinking about more in terms of the extent to which ground measurements can be really matched to what aerial images of any kind are seeing. So then thinking about what are some of the relations among cheatgrass and fire and weather patterns, both currently and what might be projected as precipitation patterns become more variable and also change directionally over time. One of the things that's pretty well known to a lot of people, you get a pretty substantial difference in the density of cheatgrass following wet years and following dry years, and obviously a difference in sort of the vigor of the plants themselves. So here's some examples of cheatgrass looking pretty darn robust following a wet year and in a dry year. There's also, as I think a lot of people are aware, a pretty substantial signal in terms of the response of cheatgrass to precipitation versus the response of native vegetation to precipitation. And this has made it much more feasible to detect cheatgrass remotely at certain times of the year because it has a substantial response to precipitation and because it greens up earlier than a lot of other plants in the region. So basically, you'll be able to pick up the cheatgrass within a year by seeing that early green signal. And then although the distribution and abundance of cheatgrass can change quite a bit among years, it's pretty easy to pick it up following a wet year. And that's the case with a lot of different types of imagery. One of the things that Bethany and her colleagues are finding is that fires in cheatgrass, as opposed to fires in other vegetation types, including pinyon and juniper, the area burned, the likelihood of fire, a lot of different metrics, they're pretty strongly associated with what happened the previous year. So you have a year's lag effect in the fires. But again, cheatgrass being much more responsive to the amount of precipitation, although now with a lag, than you'll have in other vegetation types. And so thinking about sort of the fire dynamics across the region as a whole, this is now starting to get at some of the mechanisms of, I think generally speaking, it's pretty well understood cheatgrass equals more fire and whatever metric you're using of more, but this is getting into some of the whys. And hopefully this is gonna give the management community and the research communities more ability to project where fire risk may be following certain types of winters. So over time, in the work that my colleagues and I have been doing in the Central Great Basin since the early 2000s, we've collected a lot of data on cheatgrass in both burned and non-burned areas, areas in which we primarily have been sampling birds. But because we have sampling areas across 4 mountain ranges in the Central Great Basin, we have 300 some odd points over time. We've also worked closely with Gene Chambers' group, and they have some additional data that are comparable. We've started to look at a couple different measures of cheatgrass, a couple different patterns in that central Nevada area, taking advantage of a 15-year time series. And so we've been looking at presence versus absence of cheatgrass, which we call occurrence. We've also looked at a measure of incidence, which very loosely we sometimes call abundance. We can get into some of the sampling aspects of which it's not exactly abundance, but basically how much is there type of measure. And then we've been trying to understand these patterns if you look across the landscape as a whole and also in areas that are burned versus not burned. And this is some work that's just emerging. We're hoping to submit it to a journal this winter, and it's being led by Matt Williamson, who is a PhD student at University of California, Davis. So when we look at just occurrence of cheatgrass, there are some patterns that emerge from looking at a suite of about 9 or so environmental variables, all of which are pretty well established in the literature as having some association with cheatgrass, depending on the exact measures. If you look at across the landscape as a whole, both areas that have burned and areas that have not burned, there's a negative relation between elevation and cheatgrass. So as you go higher, less cheatgrass. A very strong positive response with whether the area is burned, and also a strong positive association between the occurrence of cheatgrass and winter precipitation. In this case, defining winter as some of the climatologists do and saying it's basically October through March. There is such a strong association between presence of cheatgrass and whether an area is burned that we didn't pursue this presence-absence analysis any further for the burned areas. Basically, if it's burned, there's cheatgrass. And so on a presence-absence level, it made no sense to go any further. But then thinking about all of these areas that are not burned, where cheatgrass may be present, but often not dominant. So what's driving whether cheatgrass is present in those other areas? And again, we saw a negative relation with elevation. We saw a negative relation with spring precipitation, and then a positive relation, and this was a little bit hard to represent visually on a slide, but if you say what proportion of the winter and spring precipitation fell in winter. So basically, how heavy of a winter was it compared to the entire overwintering precipitation season, seeing a positive relation there. And we probably are going to be doing a lot more work in the coming months and talking with colleagues at Desert Research Institute and other places to try to better tease apart what's going on with the winter period versus the spring period. But these are some strong relations that we have at this point. Strong in this case has a statistical criterion. These are Bayesian analyses, and it's 90% or more of the posterior probability. I don't want to get too technical about all of that, but basically to say when I'm talking about these strong associations, there is a statistical criterion for what I'm referring to as strong. Now if we get into, again, that using the term abundance loosely, but not just is cheatgrass present, but how much cheatgrass is there, when we're looking now at all of our 300 some odd points across these 4 mountain ranges in central Nevada. For those of you that know that area, it's the Shoshone Mountains and the Toyabe, Takima, and Monitor ranges. We actually have a positive relation with elevation. Again, a pretty strong positive relation with burned. Areas that have been grazed for a higher proportion of years tend to have more cheatgrass. Again, we're getting a positive relation with winter precipitation and a negative relation with spring precipitation. And we're also getting a negative relation with perennial grass abundance, so suggesting that when you have perennial grasses, there's something for cheatgrass to compete with. Some of these things, people may be looking at this and to some extent thinking, well, duh, we knew that. A lot of the things that we think we know haven't necessarily been tested with a lot of empirical data. So we felt that it was worthwhile to go through this and say when you have a long time series, and it's fairly rare for cheatgrass to have been measured in the same places over time. So we have in some cases, 7 or more measurements over a 15-year period of cheatgrass in exactly the same location. We wish we had a lot more data, but it's a pretty good empirical data set for being able to look at some of these questions. These are the patterns that we're seeing in those areas with respect to abundance of cheatgrass. Okay, we are trying to get into both the burned and the non-burned areas with some of these abundance measures, and that's probably the next thing that we'll be clarifying over a couple of weeks. The results that are even a little bit too preliminary to present, there do seem to be some differences in the response of cheatgrass abundance in areas that are burned and areas that are not burned. Okay, so a little bit of a segue here into bird world. I know that some of this is a little bit controversial, but there's a lot of rhetoric out, and I think it's very well-intentioned rhetoric, but that various types of actions that some human communities would like to see in the environment are also beneficial for sage-grouse and preventing a sage-grouse listing. And some of sort of the conventional wisdom that's arisen about negative associations between sage-grouse and conifers that are in the literature or in sort of the anecdotal sphere are based on fairly short-term studies and some limited evidence. So I think in a lot of cases, if you're really scrutinizing the scientific evidence, it's somewhat mixed on some of these associations. There also are pretty good data suggesting, not suggesting, but documenting, these are telemetered birds, that greater sage-grouse can move through dense conifers, they can feed in and among conifers, and they can nest in conifers. And they'll do these things especially if the sagebrush in the area is of pretty poor quality from the eyes of the birds. So basically conifers are not a deal breaker for these birds, even if it's maybe not the highest quality habitat for them. In a lot of areas, if there's not a pretty robust understory below conifers, if conifers are taken out, it can take, and by conifers in this context, I'm primarily talking about juniper and pinyon and juniper, it can take quite a long time for habitat for greater sage-grouse to reestablish after that type of disturbance. And then what is starting to become addressed to a greater extent through research and in management circles is that there are a lot of other species of birds and other animals and plants that are strongly associated with these types of conifers, and that some of the management actions that are intended to benefit greater sage-grouse may have inadvertent negative effects on other species of concerns. There's also the challenge that in some cases, the mechanical activities that are associated with removal of conifers, even if it's just, moving vehicles in the area, people moving in the area, those can lead to expansion of cheatgrass. And so although, again, they're well-intentioned, they can lead to some undesired effects. So lots of other species associated with these systems, and we have data to look at some of those. And so far we've focused on the central and western Great Basin. We will be starting to look at our study areas in Idaho and Utah and comparisons among all of those areas, probably starting this winter and spring and continuing throughout the rest of the project. So in the central and western Great Basin, we have data from more from the central than the western Great Basin, but starting to accumulate a pretty good time series from a lot of mountain ranges, canyons within those mountain ranges, points within those canyons. We're collecting data at point count locations, which is a standard method for surveying birds. We're sampling within points of a 100-meter radius and making 3 visits within each breeding season. So these are breeding bird surveys. Having 3 visits, for those of you that have heard about detection probabilities and detection weighted occupancy, we can estimate detection probabilities as a function of covariates. And so then we have a lot of information about the environment, basically attributes of bird habitat. Some of those we measure at the level right around the points where we're actually doing the sampling. Some of them we're measuring at the level of canyons within which those points are embedded. And we can obtain measures over more extensive spatial areas from various forms of remote sensing. So there are a couple of ways in which, something is not showing up, but I am not going to sweat it too much. A couple of different ways in which we are looking at those data. One is to be looking at what's happening with riparian areas. So riparian areas are expected to contract and fragment in the future. That's not much of a surprise to people. Riparian areas don't only support the riparian fauna, but there's considerable evidence, as all of you know, that riparian areas also are supporting non-riparian species. So some of the sagebrush birds, what we think of as sagebrush-associated birds, what we think of as pinyon and juniper-associated birds, they're all benefiting facultatively from the riparian areas. And so what one of my students, Frank Fogarty, is starting to look at is how does the size or fragmentation of riparian areas affect species and communities, both the communities as a whole and also the riparian communities in particular. And so he has some pretty strong inferences to date just based on our existing data. So what he's finding for species richness, or the total number of species, and also for the number of records we have of individual species, quite consistently, he's finding a positive effect on riparian area. So as the total area of riparian increases, more species, and in a general sense, more individuals of a lot of particular species, and a negative effect of riparian fragmentation. He's finding also that the signal with fragmentation is much stronger than that of area. And this, again, is associated both with looking at the number of species, whether you're looking at all species of breeding birds or you're looking just at the riparian species, and also looking at species on a one-off basis. And the magnitude of those associations varies to some extent among species, and will be over the coming year or two getting into more of the potential reasons why. So just to show a couple of examples on this, this is looking at the total number of riparian species, and out of 19 that we have good data for and that we defined as more or less dependent on riparian areas for breeding and for food. And so what you can see here is species richness increases as riparian area increases. Species richness decreases as fragmentation increases. And if you look at the width of the colored lines around that black line, what you're seeing is that it's wider for riparian area than for riparian fragmentation. And that means that the estimates of riparian fragmentation effects are tighter. They're more confident. You also have a sharper change in the slope of the line for fragmentation. So you have a stronger effect, you have a more rapid exponential decline in species richness as riparian fragmentation increases, then you have an increase in species richness as riparian area increases. And in this case, there were no apparent thresholds. So it's not like you could say, at 0.2 riparian fragmentation, as we measured it in this context, all of a sudden species richness tanks or something like that. And I'm not going to get into how we measured fragmentation during the webinar, but I'm happy to discuss that with people. We're also trying to improve those measures. As a lot of you know, mapping riparian area in steep, narrow canyons in the Great Basin is rather challenging. So here's an example. I just talked about species richness. Here's an example of the number of detections of an individual species. This is not detection probability. This is just the number of detections. And so here again, you're seeing a pretty strong effect on the number of detections of riparian fragmentation. As areas become more fragmented, the number of individual birds of a given species is going down quite a bit. And so if we're thinking about, okay, management of riparian areas, what's the most important thing? Is it how much riparian there is total? Is it sort of the configuration? What we're seeing is configuration so far seems to be more strongly associated with a lot of bird-associated variables than total amount. So something else that we're starting to look at, and this is my student Martha Wolfile, is elevational movement of birds. And so what she's wondering is, if you look at elevational movements of birds, both within a particular year and also among years, is there evidence of elevational movement, first of all? And then is that associated with the number of generations that birds have in a given breeding season? Is it associated with what the birds might be eating? What might this be associated with? Obviously, there are a lot of questions about changes in elevational patterns as climate becomes more variable and changes. And also in general, a lot of things tend to move to, a lot of land uses tend to move to higher elevations throughout the bird breeding season. So to what extent can land use be informed by some of the biological patterns, especially of species of concern? And what she's seeing is some strong patterns and some not so strong patterns. And both of these are of interest. So what you're seeing here, the colored dots, and I apologize for anyone who is red-green colorblind for whom this may not work very well. For species like the warbling vireo on the left, and these are riparian species, there's some noise, but there's evidence that within a given season, these dots are the first, second, and third visit that we make during a particular year. There's some evidence that these birds are moving upslope, so they're moving up in elevation just throughout the course of a given season. So when we start doing surveys, we'll detect them lower in the canyon. As the season wears on, we're detecting them higher in the canyon. We're not seeing that for every species. So the example on the right is blue-gray gnatcatchers, and we're not seeing that type of movement in blue-gray gnatcatchers. Again, both of those patterns are of a lot of interest to us. Why are some of them moving and others of them are not moving? And again, hopefully digging a lot more into that in the coming couple of years. Now, so that's just within a season. That's within a given year. And you can see again, the contrast of looking at where there's apparent upslope movement for one of the species and not so much for the other species. Okay, now if we look at what's happening among years, don't worry so much about the visits here. This was put together for another purpose, but just look at the overall, the moving from lower left to upper right. Moving from lower left to upper right, you can see that these species are moving up to some extent among years. And I should say in the previous slide, blue-gray gnatcatcher actually is not a riparian species. We're seeing more of these types of movement. Let me go back for a second. We're seeing more of these types of movement within seasons from riparian species than from non-riparian species. So elevational movement among years is also something that we're seeing more with respect to the riparian than the non-riparian species. And this is the type of movement that a lot of has been projected to be happening more and more as climate continues to change. But again, I'm showing you two examples where we have evidence of elevational movement. I'm not showing you the examples where we don't have that evidence. So again, it's of a lot of interest to us to say what's happening, why do we have movement of some species and not movement of other species. Martha is just starting to look at phenological patterns. Basically, are the movements of birds associated with bird food? And this is pretty messy but suggestive. So these are different dates throughout one summer. And on the y-axis is the percentage of fruits that are ripe. And you can just look at the lines as being more fruits ripe, in this case of bitterbrush, and not surprisingly corresponding to elevation. So you have basically more food for birds at higher elevations later in the season. And she's trying to look at both plant phenology and insect phenology, and also at microclimate to see what might be associated with patterns where birds are moving and patterns where birds are not moving. And so I am going to leave it there and turn it over to Jimmy and turn it over to all of you. And I will just put in a plug for lots of other fantastic organisms out there as well, and hope that all of you are able to continue spending a lot of time just enjoying this fabulous place that we're able to work
in. Thanks, Erica. So all you guys on the phone, this is Jimmy. I'd rather spend the time hearing questions of the attendees, but I don't know. I guess I would just point out, yeah, Erica, the slide. You're like, yeah, this is controversial. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, this is pretty interesting stuff. I'd love to get your riparian index thing, but basically, I mean, we're doing a lot of habitat work and a lot of wildlife monitoring of, sage-grouse and a few other things, but we're doing a lot of work and pretty happy with it. So we are definitely interested in collateral effects, but I guess this is something Erica and I discussed. It's kind of hard. The timing of this is a little awkward because, it's mid-study, so we don't have the research results in, and so there's really nothing for managers to do with it yet. Just something to point out. But anyway, so right now I'd just like to turn it over to questions from attendees.
Thanks,
Great.
Jimmy.
Thank you both.
Go ahead, Liz. You have questions.
All right. We do not have any questions submitted yet at this point, but I will just remind the audience that if you have a question for one of our speakers, please go ahead and send those in now using the chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you're having a hard time finding the control panel, you may need to click the red arrow to expand it to get access to that chat box area. And I will just give a moment for anyone to go ahead and type in any questions for our presenters today, and we will have a brief Q&A session here.
Well, while folks are typing in their questions, I did have a question. We have done a lot of modeling of the hydrologic conditions that we anticipate resulting from ongoing changes in climate and precipitation patterns. Erica or Jimmy, can you share your reflections on how that might influence the riparian habitats especially the seasonality of the spring flows within the Great Basin.
What the climatologists are saying is that in some cases snowmelt is going to come earlier and probably stronger, and water availability later in the growing season will be reduced. In general, across the West, precipitation is becoming more variable, and the number of storms is becoming smaller, and the intensity of those storms is becoming greater. But there's a tremendous amount of noise around that. It has generally been easier to measure temperature and to make temperature projections than precipitation projections. But the challenge in places like the Great Basin is broad sweeping generalization. Because it's a desert, it's more sensitive to precipitation than to temperature. So it's kind of tricky in that region. There's also, as everyone's pretty well aware, one of the handicaps for us in the region is that there are very few weather stations. And so how do you validate the projections of climate models? Well, generally with empirical data. And so with few weather stations, it makes it difficult to have a really good understanding of how things are changing on the ground now. And Rick, I don't know if that answers your question.
Rick, if you were responding, you may be on mute.
Thanks. Yes, I was. This is a bit of a plug for the webinar taking place next week on the 19th with Dr. Lorraine Flint from the USGS, who has completed a very high-resolution hydrologic modeling for the Great Basin in California, and in showing or linking the hydrologic condition to climate projections using a variety of methods that she'll describe. And so I wanted to give those who are on the phone now a chance to register for that event if they have not already. Okay, Liz, any typed questions?
Yeah, we have one question that came in here. So Erica, could you give a brief explanation of your riparian fragmentation index?
Yeah, the way that we have looked at it so far is saying for if I'm going to put it in human terms, if you're standing in the middle of a patch of riparian, where is the closest riparian patch to you? So basically, how far separated on average within a canyon, so this is a canyon level measure, how separated are the riparian areas within that canyon as a whole? So it's sort of a measure of patchiness of the riparian within a canyon.
Thank you, and hopefully that answered the question for our participant. And if there are any follow-up questions, please continue to go ahead and add those in. And we just got someone was asking about contact information, and I will actually go ahead and switch over to a other screen just so folks can know how they can get in touch with Erica and others.
Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank Dr. Erica Fleishman and Ms. Jimi Gragg for their taking the time to give us this presentation today. It was very interesting, and I can't wait to see the final results from this work. I look forward to seeing how we can help apply the results in a variety of contexts going forward. Thank you so very much. And I wanted to thank all of those on the webinar today for attending. A recording of this presentation will be available on our website. As I mentioned, it should be just in a day or so. If you have any questions about the LCC or this research, please feel free to contact myself, Erica, or Jimmy. Our contact information is displayed on the screen. Now, last but not least, we really want to know what you thought of today's webinar. So please take our short 2-minute survey that will appear on your screen as you log off today. Your feedback is very important to us and helps us to plan and improve future webinars. If there are no questions, I'd like to say thank you and look forward to seeing you all again. Have a great day. Bye now.